Welcome to the Cypher Podcast, where we discuss all things sci and paranormal through the lens of remote viewing. I'm your co-host, Brett Stewart, with Emily and David, and we have a really cool show and topic, I think, for everybody today. It's something I actually had never even heard of before, but we did some remote viewing work on it. What David and I did, Emily's going to give us a bit of an overview of this, and it's a really interesting mystery in the Sahara Desert. I think it's also called the Richat structure. And I think, Emily, maybe you can begin and set the stage for what this topic is, before we jump into our data.
Hi, I'm Emily, and I just wanted to say that I'm looking forward to this exploration. It's one of our first deep dives into a geological site that may have some historical significance. And as Brett mentioned, the Richat structure is it's actually visible from space. It's a giant geological formation on the west coast of the Sahara Desert, or where the Sahara Desert sort of comes near the Atlantic Ocean. And apparently, astronauts are instructed to use it to orient themselves if they ever are struggling with orienting themselves in terms of where they are on the planet. It's that prominent. And so we have some remote viewing data. We had our remote viewers, Brett and David, look at this structure and specifically look at what were the most significant events in history as they relate to this structure. And so I'm sure they'll be getting into their sessions shortly. I just wanted to give you a bit of a background on what people think, why we even chose this as a remote viewing topic, and what some of the theories are around the Richat structure. So it is this natural formation, and I don't think there's a lot of debate around the fact that it was formed as a result of a volcanic dome sort of rising and falling, and it created these concentric circles, quite large, many kilometers or miles in diameter. And then the next layer of the speculation, or the thinking, is that anywhere on Earth where we had something really interesting geologically speaking, we do find, generally speaking, signs of humans living there at some point in the past, because humans have lived all over the earth and they like to live in places that are unique and interesting. So that's also potentially controversial. Some people say that there have been things like arrowheads and other pottery and pieces of human civilization found there. Some may argue that that is not good data, but that's what many people say has been discovered in this site. And then finally, there has been some speculation over the past few years. I think the speculation was really brought into the modern day zeitgeist, if you will, that this could have been Atlantis, and it was brought into that awareness through, I believe it was a Gaia documentary, and then a fellow named Jimmy at Bright Insight, he's got a YouTube channel, popularized this theory from this documentary. He admits that he didn't come up with it himself. He admits that he was inspired by this documentary, and he's done a lot of investigations into the Richat structure being Atlantis, and there's a lot of things that match up and some things that don't. And I'm sure we'll get into some of the controversy around that in the after hours. But the high level origin story of this is that it's reported in Plato's writings. Plato, a famous person from history, apparently wrote that these are all the properties of Atlantis and they match nicely with the Richat structure. Allegedly, there's certainly some debate around that. And Plato, of course, didn't get this information himself. He got it from a fellow named Solon, an ancestor of his. And Solon apparently got it from the Egyptians. So there's a whole 4 layers of hearsay. So Plato specifically said that there were land formations in concentric circles, as far as I understand. So there were basically 3 circles of water with 2 circles of land plus a center island, which does match very nicely onto the actual geological formation we see today. There's some debate about the diameters of how many stadia or stadion were associated with the diameter of Atlantis, and what that dimension even means in modern times is under a fierce debate. But the ballpark numbers do actually work out. There was also a mountain range. He said the Atlas Mountains were to the north, and there is in fact a mountain range to the north. He said it was near a ocean, which at that time, when this could have been habitated, was actually near an ocean, much closer than it is today. So that was the background on the Richat structure itself and some of the speculations and theories around the structure. I'd like to start out with getting David to share some of the insights he got from his remote viewing sessions, some of his data. David, do you want to share some of that with us?
Hi. So my data, it's describing the motion of a vehicle in a very slow and controlled way, where it goes from A to B and then stops. It stops mattering at that point. And this is all about observation and this thing being seen from afar. It's that sort of like when you look at it from a certain angle, it's an illusion or a storytelling thing. It didn't seem exactly deceptive. And the audience was, I wrote, they want to believe. They were in on it. This was a thought-provoking thing, almost like performance art or something. I did get in terms of the lower level data, I did get the land structure, the complex surface geometry, the sort of trenches, the steepness. And interestingly, as far as dating this stuff goes, water, that it was steep down and wet at the bottom. And I think we do know from analysis of the sediments that have been found there that it did used to be very wet. Um, there's like marine sediments even, I think. And about 10,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, when you've got all the glaciers melting, this is believed to be the origin of your modern flood myths that occur in every society. So I think Plato has a accurate oral history about, there was this place, people lived there, and it used to be wet, and then there was a catastrophe, which, figures a lot of places there was a catastrophe at that period, um, due to the climate changing at the end of the ice age. So I suppose the question is, what was there? Because there's something interesting, but I don't think my data really say quite what it is.
Well, thank you for that, David. It is actually quite interesting that you keyed in on that time period because the tasking was to actually go to the most significant time for this particular location. It's very interesting that you zeroed in on the end of I believe they call it the Younger Dryas, the end of the last ice age at that location. So I'd like to switch over now to Brett. Brett, do you want to share with us what your RV data uncovered?
Sure. I had a pretty wide range of descriptions about the location, also just through the lens of what the tasking was, the most significant event to kind of occur there. There's quite a bit, so maybe a good place to start is what I found there first, and then maybe afterwards we can discuss the actual events that arrived in my session work. So I did several ERV sessions for this, and the very beginning, just to set the stage for what I saw first, is I appeared at the site, over the site, in the air, looking down at it, and it immediately reminded me of Egypt because there was a massive delta. There was a lot of water that looked like it was inland, but also attached to a sea or an ocean. So it definitely was a coastal location. There were pyramids there. There was something that looked like a sphinx very close to the water there. But I looked around and I didn't see Giza. So it's it's very easy to denote that those structures are very three pyramids right next to each other, and I did not see that. I did see other pyramids, but it reminded me of Egypt due to the architecture that existed on the ground. As I began to explore the site and move down to ground level and look around, I did notice that there was a very large city also present at the site. And there were really massive walls. Later on, I moved back up over the city to get an understanding of what the city looked like. But first, I moved kind of down, looking at the landscape, saw the city in the distance, and then started moving towards the city. And a lot of the structures, interestingly, reminded me, at least on the outskirts, and even actually once I started getting more inwards in the city, reminded me a bit of like Venice, because there was so much water. This delta was just everywhere, that a lot of the structures were built on top of it. It was the structures and walkways were elevated in a lot of the areas. Anyway, that was the where I arrived first. I moved forward to explore the city, and there was a rather large entrance where I entered, and it appeared that the entrance that I took in the ERV session was from seaside going inland, and there was a really long road. It was interesting listening to David's remote viewing data about a vehicle, and there was this kind of strangeness about it, or performance art about it, because on this road that went from, I would say, the outside of where the city was through this first gate or wall, and it seemed to go miles and miles and miles inland, there was a platform that you could step onto that would move and take you in a straight line to the center of the city. And I didn't notice any mechanisms. There were no machines it just looked like a slab that you could walk onto and then started moving. So I don't know what kind of technology that would be that would create a system like that, but it seemed that's what was going on. And so I kind of hopped a ride aboard this slab and just let myself be a tourist, if you will, in the city. What would I see from the tram moving inwards? And as I was moving towards the center of the city, it was elevated. It was maybe like 40 to 50 feet off the ground in some places. So I had a little bit of vision in the distance. It was a lot of water. There were a lot of waterfalls everywhere. They appeared to they looked like man-made waterfalls in a lot of locations. I think a lot of water was also being redirected to this location from other places, because I saw aqueducts and seems like a lot of structures to create this type of environment where there was more water in one area. I do think that there was actually a kind of dam there as well, as what I saw, like the energy was being harvested in some capacity. I really didn't look too detailed into it, but it did seem part of the structures that were there. But there was a lot of statues that were really detailed, and they looked exactly what I would envision I'd see in Egypt. If there were a lot of statues in Egypt, there was the headdress. There were feminine faces with a really tall headdress that I don't know the right name for that, but I've seen the images of that. I saw a lot of those, and these were massive, massive statues. These were like 30 to 40 feet high and carved and just placed all around, like decorated around this location. But on the outskirts, it was mostly green and delta. There were small structures, but not a lot. And there was in this kind of central walkway that was on a slab taking me in, and it would take anyone from the outside of the city towards the inner. Once I kind of started getting into the city a little bit more, I moved my perception up into the sky to say, okay, well, what am I dealing with here as far as the city is concerned? And immediately it stood out to me as several rings, but concentric rings. And on each ring, it seemed there were different living spaces. And the further that this tram, for lack of a better word, would take you in towards the very center, think of like a bullseye, and there was a bunch of lines that were coming from the outside in. So that was now looking at the actual space photographs of this ground formation, it was matched very, very similar to those concentric rings.
Well, thanks for that, Brett. I think there's some very interesting parallels there. I actually saw, when I first looked at the RV data, I actually saw David's session first. And I did see this machine, for lack of a better term, that was moving on a fixed track. And immediately my mind went to some sort of a transportation system. And it's very interesting that ties in with your session as well. I think another parallel between the two sessions is when David got the perspective being something that people are concerned about. I mean, when you think about it, architects and designers are often concerned about perspective and a particular way of seeing a building or structure or statue from a particular sightline. So it doesn't necessarily to me at least, seemed like it could be foolery or trickery or fakery. Very often, those things are associated with sight lines or perspective, forced perspective on an architectural level.
Well, this appeared to me to be like the thing was moving because it was being observed, or its function was to be observed and have this presentational aspect. It wasn't like the observation wasn't from the perspective of the vehicle. I'm not. I mean, in my first session, I drew like a little train carriage almost, and I said it reminds me of like a ride at Disney World. Um, but then it seemed to be the observation was, you come around a corner or go over the brow of a hill. I think it was over a hill, I said, funnily. And then this thing sets off and you see it moving, but it's like just timed at the right time so that it all looks perfect. Um, which is why I had this like fakery idea.
I think what I noticed in my ERV session is the way things were laid out was kind of like a Disney ride. The way the statues were positioned, if you were to stand on this platform, like you're remind me a little bit of Jurassic Park, where in the movie they'd sit on the cars and they take the nice little roundabout to see the the dinosaurs. It was like that, but it was that along with it felt like transportation for the city, but there was something weird about the transportation itself too. I didn't see any moving parts. I didn't see any conductor. Everything was also white, as far as it was like this marble kind of white color that a whole bunch of people could get onto and just stand. I didn't see seats, but there might have been seats. And then it eventually would just slowly start to move and then pick up a little bit of speed. Didn't go that fast. Maybe like a subway speed. It wasn't high speed rails or anything, and there wasn't really any sound I noticed with it either. So I don't know if it's like on some slicked up track or I have no idea, but it seemed to just move of its own volition on a timing without someone operating it. So it was kind of strange.
I got some stuff which maybe fills in the blanks there. Again, it makes me suspicious because it's not quite real. I wrote wireframey. It's kind of like a 3D model, and I used analogies like this. Like there's nothing inside, it's just the surface projection that we're seeing here. And it's not a normal physical object that you could pick up and touch. The emotional content associated with that was detached, almost flippant, sporadic attention as opposed to focused, which very much fits in with it being public transit. It's moving, motion related, functional. It swings from place to place or time to time, which is interesting. I had this time, space, what's going on here? It goes from here to there, a well defined route, uninteresting. It's really well defined what it's going to do, and it always does it that way. No surprises. It's like the subway.
That fits exactly my impression of this. And so it was very scenic. You could look around and have wonderful views, but it was just a hop on the public transport. Where are you going in the city? And it didn't really have much more to it than that.
Yeah, it does sound like both sessions have some common ground there. I'm hoping that we can get some more insight from you, Brett, on what else you discovered in terms of the city's inhabitants and some of the communications you had with those inhabitants.
Sure. So moving forward in my ERV session, as I'm on this this Disney ride almost of a tram or a tourist visiting this ringed city, uh, as I got closer towards the center, I started seeing a lot more structures where people were living, as opposed to on the outer skirts. There was a lot more greenery. It seemed a lot more natural landscape, forested type area. Lots of aqueducts, and it looks like probably where they would grow the food was more in the outer rings, is what it appeared to me. Once I started getting to around the center ring, I started seeing a lot more habitats where people would live. And it really looked similar. The way they had designed the living quarters is it reminded me of a rather famous city in Greece. The city is Santorini. And it's where all these kind of squares and curved structures are all stacked and built right on top of one another. and there's these really narrow walkways. It's all ground traffic. There were no vehicles. No one's driving cars anywhere. Everything is ground traffic, and all the buildings are almost stacked on top of each other to make room for a really large population. I didn't really get off here. It's just more from a distance. I observed these structures from the tram. So I continued onward into the city, and I finally got to the center, and there was a central platform in the very middle, and this is what the kind of the end of the line was for the moving platform, where all the ground traffic would get on and off. And the way it looked, there was this massive tower right in the middle. There were a lot of other structures, lower structures around it, but they almost looked like stone skyscrapers. It was really kind of fascinating to see, all bleached white. Everything was bleached white, interestingly. Even the clothes that everyone was wearing, that the citizens of this location were wearing, everyone was wearing white. Some had some golden, colorful accents, but it was mostly, everyone just had decided this is the color we're going to wear, and this is the color of the city. So very clean. I didn't see any garbage anywhere. But anyway, so I got to the center of the city, and from a top view down, it looked like there was a circular center, and then off the circular island, there were these petals that went all the way around, and these petals had other structures on them. And so the center looked like a flower floating on water due to the nature of all the delta water underneath. Again, it reminded me almost of being in Venice, where all the structures and walkways are built over water. And that's what I was seeing. Another thing to note about the inhabitants of the city, I did not see a single European. There are no Europeans there. Everyone had very dark skin. It appeared one particular person on the side of the street that caught my attention was a really beautiful African woman, and she had a white dress with golden curls in her hair, and she really stuck out. She had this long flowing dress behind her, but it definitely did not have a European vibe whatsoever to the inhabitants of this city. And so with that, I decided, well, what does a good tourist do when they don't know what to look at in a city? Well, they ask somebody. So in my ERV session, I just set my little prompt for myself. I said, well, take me to the optimum individual to get more information about this location, since I don't even know what to go look at or what to ask. And my attention caught on to, it looked like almost a city guard, but it didn't have any weapons on him. It was just a guy standing kind of in an elevated position where he could overlook the crowd, wearing all white, had a white cowl over his head, so you really couldn't, probably just to block out the sun because it was a very sunny day there. And I just asked, hey, could you tell me about this city? And it was kind of an interesting thing because the individual himself, he looked Arabian, but he also had like this wizened kind of mystic look and feel about him. And I almost got the impression that he knew something non-physical was there. When, well, what is my perception position? Well, it's just a non-physical conscious awareness. My impression, though, is what his job was to detect threats to the city, to the inhabitants of the city. He's like an alarm. He's like a canary in a coal mine as far as psychic threats. So I thought that was kind of strange. But anyway, I asked him, well, what is hey, I'm just a tourist. I'm no harm here. I'm interested about your city. Can you tell me about it? And the first thing he really described to me is that this is considered the greatest achievement of mankind. This particular city, at least according to him at this point in time. That's what he viewed this. And he pointed me to some other thing that was located in one of the buildings in the center, which was this very large, round, golden discs. There was a bunch of them that had writing. It looked like Arabic and pictographs on them that said, oh, you want to go know the full history of the city? You would go there, and you could read about the full history of the city in this historical building.
That's a very interesting story, Brett. I think that, well, I'm not sure. David, how would you, does this in any way, shape, or form tie into your session data? Did you have, that you feel, any interaction with anything that would resemble a city inhabitant or someone at the city itself, if you even perceived a city.
I did write urban and describe an urban environment, but the life was different. The life that showed up in my session was different anyway. Um, in both sessions, I got a life form which didn't have a sense of self as an individual, which is something I often get for animals. This is a thing that doesn't say me and I am. So my interpretation of that in light of the other data I got is that this is like either a collective unconscious thing or even a hive mind if you want to be dramatic about it.
Yeah, so it's very interesting. I can't remember exactly where I was listening to another podcast this week, and for some reason they were mentioning that in the current time, it seems like humans are more individualistic than they perhaps were in the ancient past. So there are people who actually theorize that in historic times, humans were in sort of a different way of being. I don't really want to tie evolution into this, but that human consciousness was more sort of collectively connected, and so that may be something that you were picking up on. It's just a theory that I heard this week, but it's very interesting.
Well, the life in my second session, I think, could be consistent with that. Um, I said they're warm, upright, standing, or leaning. They're a person. But then, state of mind, they were relaxed. I said they're not really doing much. They have a wide focus, something like a daydreaming state of mind. Um, their state or activity is just like open and chilled out, I wrote. They're not doing, they're just being. There's no pressure, not worrying, pausing, taking a moment, taking a breath, a break. Um, their gaze is just open. There's no focus. They're not looking at anything in particular. They're just completely zoned out. And I don't know whether this is a real life, as an individual or as a representation, like a generalization about the people there, or whether this is maybe describing something else. Um, if so, I don't know exactly what. I can't really make concrete sense of these data, but that's what I got, and it is consistent with this idea in some ways, I think.
It's an interesting idea to think about. If it was a different way of being, were people perhaps more open telepathically with one another? My first impression of when I asked to be taken to the life form present at the site that could tell me about the city, my immediate reaction, my immediate first response was, this is a psychically developed individual that could sense things. And that was kind of what his job was. But when I looked around it, because he was standing kind of up on a ledge looking over a large courtyard where there were hundreds of people going about their day. It wasn't like a busy city street in New York, though, where it's loud and there's things going on and everyone's haphazard. Everyone's got different. It was all kind of just calm, and everyone looked the same. They all wore white, and it was just lots of footsteps, people going different places. If someone was talking, it was really quiet, but it wasn't like a really loud city. And I don't know if you want me to go. Do you want me to go into the city origins, Emily?
Let's get into the city origins a little bit. I think that's something that's very important, especially for setting the stage for some of the other data about the beginning and the end of this city.
Yeah, so I asked my guide about how the city began. And my question for that came off of, he was pointing to me to, hey, you should go look at this one building over there. You'll probably find it really interesting. It's empty. It's just a monument, but maybe you'll find it interesting. And what this building was very grand. It was an opulent building, had huge doors, large steps walking up to it, and just one of these massive towers in the center of the city. And as the doors open, there's a long walkway with a red, actually like a really bright red carpet going down, maybe 8 feet wide walkway, about, I don't know, 300 meters up to a platform that had chairs on it. They're massive, just looked like marble thrones, but there's no one sitting on them. And that's what he mentioned. He's like, this is more of a monument. It's almost like they didn't have a ruler, so to speak, but this was built for the people, quote unquote, who ruled or started the city. And I asked him, well, who's that? And all he did was he pointed up to the sky and he said, they come from the stars. And I almost felt like he didn't really believe it, though. It felt to me like that was a story he had been told, is that the people who started this city, which was way before he was alive, those people built this throne room for those who came from the stars. They're no longer around anymore, but it's a story that was passed down, and he's recounting it like a good tourist guide to me. So I'm not sure if that actually is the case, that the origins of the city are extraterrestrial in nature, but one of the individuals who lived in it seemed to believe that himself. And there was a whole monument to that idea at the center of the city. So it was definitely a really, really beautiful structure, but no king and queen were sitting on the throne. Let's say that.
Yeah, so I just want to remind the listener that this was a blind session, so it could have literally been anything that I tasked Brett with. And obviously there was a particular piece of data that I was looking for to see if Brett was on target, which was that it's very obvious there are these concentric rings. And when Brett's session came back with concentric rings, we call that on target in the RV world. We know that Brett didn't RV my breakfast or the baseball game from who knows when. He was definitely at this particular location. So when we get such prominent features at a site and they correlate with the RV data, we feel that the data is more or less on target. I think we've gone over a good chunk of our data that we want to share here in the main part of our show. I think that there are a few bits that we've left out and saved some interesting conversations for the after hours. I do want to give a shout out to Jimmy at Bright Insight. Thank you for your wonderful videos and a little bit of inspiration for our show here and our tasking. And hopefully people find this an interesting data point to add to the mystery. I think there's lots of people that are looking into this, and this is our take on it.
Yeah, and I think in the after hours, we're going to talk a little bit about maybe some of our other opinions on the subject that we haven't already. But I had other data as well. It's, again, just a story. But we're going to look at the end of the city. Why is it no longer around? What came up in some of the RV data surrounding that. And I think I may have also, in one of my ERV sessions, described a slightly different significant event other than just the city being there, related to an invasion from an outside force. So it was an interesting ERV session. We'll be going over those details in the After Hours members episode. So anything else that you guys want to add before we wrap up?
Well, in the after hours, I'm also quite looking forward to talking about 19th century occultism and how that relates to this mystery.
I can't wait to hear it. Great. All right. Well, that'll wrap up this show of the Cypher Podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. If you would like to get access to the After Hours episode, you can go to our website. It's either remoteviewingpodcast.com or cypher.com. Links will be down in the description below. We hope you'll join us there. And if not, though, we will see you on the next podcast. Take care.